Welcome to part B of Parashat Vayikra, where we are talking about the sacrificial system of the days of the TaNaKH, particularly as they are outlined in the Book of Leviticus, chapters 1 through 5, or 1 through 6, as it shows up in your English versions. And at this point in time, we've already done a background look at the details of the worshiper and the meaning of the word kafar, which we're familiar with the word kippur in Yom Kippur. The word is usually rendered atonement. But now I'd like to move on to the different types of offerings that are mentioned in the book of Leviticus. This is part B, and so if you've not heard part A yet, it's about 40 minutes long. I really suggest that you go back and listen to that first before you jump into part B. But if you're ready to go, then let's go. This next section is entitled Types of Offering. In all fairness, the topic of animal sacrifices was really not introduced in Leviticus. It was actually introduced to us way back in Exodus chapter 29, verses 38 through 46. So let's go backwards a little bit and read that passage so we can understand where sacrifices were really introduced to us. This is Exodus 29, verses 38 through 46 from the CJB. Quote, "Now this is what you are to offer on the altar: 2 lambs a year old, regularly, every day. The one lamb you are to offer in the morning, and the other lamb at dusk. With the one lamb offer 2 quarts of finely ground flour mixed with 1 quart of oil pressed from olives, along with 1 quart of wine as a drink offering. The other lamb you are to offer at dusk. Do with it as with the morning grain and drink offerings. It will be a pleasing aroma, an offering made to Adonai by fire. Through all your generations, this is to be the regular burnt offering at the entrance to the tent of meeting before Adonai. This is where I will meet with you to speak with you. There I will meet with the people of Israel, and the place will be consecrated by my glory. I will consecrate the tent of meeting and the altar. Likewise, I will consecrate Aharon and his sons to serve me in the office of Cohen. Then I will live with the people of Israel and be their God. They will know that I am Adonai their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt in order to live with them. I am Adonai their God." End quote. Okay, this passage is telling us that the first offering of the day was a burnt offering, an olah, which is what the word burnt offering is rendered in most translations in olah, and or how it's rendered from the original Hebrew. But the olah, or the burnt offering, and we're going to talk about the olah in a second, that which goes up on the altar in smoke. But the olah, the first offering, was actually a continual offering of 2 lambs, 1 in the morning and 1 in the evening or at dusk. We call this continual offering the tamid offering, T-A-M-I-D, tamid. The word tamid simply means continual. So, as we read these verses in Exodus, as we're going to start studying Leviticus, we remind ourselves that first, before we start learning about other offerings, we have to remind ourselves that God is really instituting the Tamid offering. And since it's the Tamid offering that's in view here, we've got to actually stop and look at that and how it bears relevance for the worshiper of those days. Because it, as we're going to find out, it's not actually the worshiper who's offering the Tamid offering or bringing the Tamid sacrifice. It's actually the priest. FFOZ, First Fruits of Zion, has provided precise and theologically sound and theologically sound explanation for understanding the Tamid offering mentioned in this passage. Let me just look it up here. Has provided a precise and theologically sound. Here we go. Let me read the quote for you from FFOZ's article. And this is taken from First Fruits of Zion, their weekly e-drash. That you can sign up for and receive by email every day, or every week, And the article is entitled "The Daily Continual Burnt Offering." It's actually a PDF file available on their website at ffoz.org. Let's read their quote. Quote, Exodus chapter 29, verses 38 through 42. God ordained a daily worship service in the tabernacle. The daily worship service was called the continual burnt offering. Every day 2 male lambs were offered up as burnt offerings for this daily sacrifice. The continual burnt offering, called the tamid, began each morning with a male lamb offered as a burnt offering. The burnt offering is called an olah. The lamb was slaughtered and placed on the fire on the altar as the first sacrifice of each day. Each subsequent sacrifice that day was placed on top of the continual burnt offering lamb. The lamb burned on the fire all day. When the day service was over and all the other offerings had been brought, a second lamb was slaughtered as an olah and placed on top of the remains of that day's offering. The effect was that of sandwiching the whole day's services between the two lambs of the continual burnt offering. The second lamb was left on the altar to burn throughout the night. The next morning, the ashes were removed and a new lamb was slaughtered and placed on the altar, beginning the process all over. Thus, a lamb was continually burning on the altar before the Lord. The temple's entire sacrificial system began with an olah, was offered on top of the olah, and was concluded with an olah. These olah offerings were called the continual burnt offering because one of them was continually on the altar fire. The continual burnt offering was the most basic and regular function of the tabernacle in the temple. The prayer services, the singing of psalms, the lighting of the menorah, the burning of incense, all occurred in conjunction with the continual offering. The continual burnt offering is the very center of the entire worship system. The continual burnt offering was to be a remembrance of the offering made during the Exodus 24 covenant ceremony at Mount Sinai. For this reason, the burnt offering was to be continually upon the altar as a permanent token of the covenant. Its blood, splashed daily against the altar, was a reminder of the blood Moses splashed against the altar and onto the people. Without the continual burnt offering, no other sacrifices were possible. So too, without the covenant status, no further relationship with God was possible. And FFOZ goes on to conclude, quote, "It is most likely a reference to the continual burnt offering which prompts Yochanan the Immerser, or John the Baptist, to declare Yeshua as, quote, the Lamb of God, from John chapter 1, verse 29, end quote." So, that was a very good quote lifted from FFOZ's article there. What are we to make of the information given to us? Well, as we can begin to see, the Tamid offering was the first offering, an olah, as presented at the beginning of each day. It's the olah as brought forth by the priests that really sets the pace or the tone for every other offering that would be brought that day. Jacob Milgram takes note of the Tamid in his JPS commentary to Numbers. Let's pull a quote from the Jewish Publication Society commentary to the Book of Numbers, published in 1990, from page 240. Quote, Abravanel remarks that the initial prescription ordaining the Tamid, quote, throughout the generations at the tent of meeting, end quote, taken from Exodus 29:42, means that it never ceased. In support, one should note that the text of the first public sacrifices in the tabernacle explicitly states that it was offered, quote, in addition to the burnt offering of the morning. And you can reference Leviticus 9:17, meaning the Tamid, end quote. So, Milgram brings up a very important point, is that we should understand again that the Tamid and the other offerings of the day have a relationship one to another. It is the Tamid that is also, by the way, described in these verses in the Book of Numbers. Let's read those. Numbers chapter 28, verses 1 through 8, again from the Complete Jewish Bible. Quote, Adonai said to Moshe, "Give an order to the people of Israel. Tell them, you are to take care to offer me at the proper time the food presented to me as offerings made by fire, providing a fragrant aroma for me. Tell them this is the offering made by fire that you are to bring to Adonai, male lambs in their first year and without defect, 2 daily as a regular burnt offering. Offer the one lamb in the morning and the other lamb at dusk, along with 2 quarts of fine flour as a grain offering mixed with 1 quart of oil from pressed olives. It is the regular burnt offering, the same as was offered on Mount Sinai, to give a fragrant aroma, an offering made by fire for Adonai. Its drink offering is to be 1/4 hin for 1 lamb. In the holy place you are to pour out a drink offering of intoxicating liquor to Adonai. The other lamb you are to present at dusk. Present it with the same kind of grain offering and drink offering as in the morning. It is an offering made by fire with a fragrant aroma for Adonai, end quote. So we've taken the time to detail the olah along with the tamid so that we can get a better look at the next few sacrifices that are going to be studied. We're going to study 5 more sacrifices in addition to the one that we just looked at. We really looked at the tamid, which categorically is an olah. The regular offering, the continual offering, viz. Tamid, is really a burnt offering. Categorically, it's an olah. And so, with the tamid now explained, we're better poised to examine the remaining 5 offerings of Leviticus chapters 1 through 5. Now, these types of offerings, these 5 types of offerings that are introduced in the pages of Leviticus are broken down into the different categories, and that's where we're going to go next in this study. We're going to look at, first of all, the olah, which is a burnt offering, which is mentioned in Leviticus chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. Next, in order, and I'm going in order of the way they're given to us in Leviticus. Next, we'll look at the mincha, which is sometimes translated as the grain offering, or other times it's translated as a fellowship offering. The mincha is mentioned in Leviticus chapter 2, verses 1 through 16. Next on the list, we'll study the shlamim, which is rendered the peace offering, or also that one's sometimes rendered fellowship offering as well. In your English translations. That's mentioned in Leviticus chapter 3, verses 1 through 17. Then we'll look at the chata'at, which is the sin offering, mentioned in Leviticus chapter 4, verses 1 through 35, as well as chapter 5, verses 1 through 13. And then we'll look at the asham, which is the guilt offering, mentioned in Leviticus chapter 5, verses 14 through 26. Those 5, the olah, the mincha, the shlamim, the chata'at, and the asham. Those are the 5 categories of offerings that will span the entire range of the book of Leviticus. And indeed, as we study other subsequent sacrifices in the future, we'll find that they bear a resemblance to one of these 5, or sometimes a combination thereof, of the 5 offerings that we're studying right here. For instance, I'll just tell you right now, you'll find often that the olah is often brought, the burnt offering is also brought in conjunction with a grain offering. They're brought together at often times. So, within these 5 categories, we also need to break down a subcategory. We'll find out that the first 3 of these 5, the olah, the mincha, and the shlamim, the first 3 could easily be considered free will offerings, brought before Hashem by anyone at various times in the life of anyone in the community. By comparison, the last 2, the chata'at and the asham, were required, they were mandatory to make restitution for various types of sins. Such korbanot, such offerings, and I'm going to try and introduce a new Hebrew word to you readers and you listeners. Korbanot. The root word korban is singular for offering or sacrifice, and thus korbanot is sacrifices. Such korbanot, the chata'at and the asham, are referred to in many places as expiatory. Okay, that is to say they affect sin, they affect atonement, whereas the first 3 by comparison are non-expiatory. That is to say, they don't necessarily affect atonement. The expiatory korbanot shall occupy the bulk of the latter part of my commentary. Now, Chabad.org is going to supply us with our standard descriptions for these first 3 korbanot. If you look at the footnote number 10, you'll see that I'm taking this information from www.chabad, that's C-H-A-B like boy, A, D like David, .org, /parashah, /in-depth, /default, and then more information given there. If you really are interested in going to Chabad.org's website, just go to Chabad.org and look for the parashah readings for this week, or parashah archives, and you can pull up the information there. Okay, let's go ahead. First offering is the olah offering, and it's also referred to as the burnt offering. In fact, most of your English versions are simply going to call it the burnt offering. But I want you to know the Hebrew words, because later on when we get down near some of the technical terms, for instance, we're trying to explain which offerings relate to which particular infractions, which particular sins, particularly when we get down to the expiatory ones, it's important that we know that the language of the chata'at and the asham, the sin offering and the guilt offering, respectively, it's important that some of the language that we realize is interchangeable, because a chata'ah is a class of sin, and an asham is a class of sin, and yet if you commit a sin, you're guilty, and the word guilt is asham, and so sometimes you can get confused if you don't really follow the Hebrew terms a little closer than we're used to following them. First category of korban, the olah, the burnt offering. If you're following along in the written notes, we're near the top of page 9. Here's the quote from Chabad. The first korban to be described is the olah, of course, first one to be described in the Book of Leviticus. And it's described as the ascending offering. It's commonly referred to as the burnt offering. Here's another reason why I'd like you to know the particular Hebrew terms. Because the word olah can refer to ascending, as to that which goes up. Picture in your mind the animals being placed on the altar, and it's not being eaten by the Kohanim, nor is it being eaten by the participants. Therefore, all of it goes up in smoke, except for the blood that's poured out on the altar, of course, and such. The hide also doesn't get burnt; it gets skinned and removed. But all of it goes up on the altar, and as it goes up, as the ashes, the embers, and the smoke, and all of that ascends heavenward, then the word picture is described by this verb Allah or olah, and that's where we get the term for the category. The olah itself goes up, it ascends. Your Bibles, your English Bibles, are variously going to translate this as the burnt offering. Some will describe it as what else do we have? The whole burnt offering, the smoke offering, the fire offering, or something to that effect. And so the olah is the Hebrew word, right? This offering, whose distinguishing feature is that it is raised to God in its entirety by the fire, which is atop the mizbeach, there, the altar. The olah can also be a male or sheep or goat. It can be a male sheep or a goat, in which case the same procedure is allowed. There's no difference if it's either animal. Now, we can also, however, downgrade the animal when it comes to an olah, and I believe this speaks of the different economic statuses that we may find in ancient Israel. Some people can afford a male sheep or a goat. Other people who were less how should we say, they didn't have as much money, or maybe they weren't in a position where they worked for someone who had money. Maybe they were a slave and they didn't have their own money, but their master had a lot of money, and their master wasn't going to permit them to take one of the larger animals. Well, then God allowed smaller animals. Let's keep reading. A turtle dove or a young pigeon, we're talking about birds now, right, can also be brought as an ascending offering. And instead of being slaughtered through shechita, that's the process whereby the rabbis determined that God wanted the blood poured out completely while, if possible, the heart of the animal was still beating. We took a very sharp knife and slit the throat, usually one or two, if I remember correctly, to shecht an animal, to slit its throat involved pushing the sharp blade forward once and then pulling it back towards the person who's holding the blade, and that would give a clean cut. This shechting, the shechita, done to an animal while it was still alive, obviously, produced an effect that there was no pain. The animal didn't. In fact, the blade was so sharp, the animal's throat was cut before it realized that it had even been cut. What's more, because of where it was cut, where the animal's throat was cut, then a certain nerve leading to the brain, the pain center in the brain, is actually severed instantly, and so the animal doesn't really feel any pain either. It just dies, but it doesn't know it dies. I mean, 1 minute it's conscious, the next minute, no. And so this procedure also allowed for the blood to be pumped out by the still beating heart. This was important because later on we're going to find that God prohibited blood from being consumed, and at any location or at any instance, whenever an animal's life was being taken, blood was always to be poured out. In this case, it's going to be dashed on the altar, on the mizbeach there, out here in the chutzner, in the courtyard. So we're talking about a larger animal where we could shecht its throat and easily catch the blood. But with a smaller animal, such as a turtle dove or a pigeon, instead of being slaughtered through shechita, the cutting of the throat, the bird is killed by malika, when that's where the priest or the Kohen officiating takes his fingernail and he nips off the head of the bird from the back of the neck, where he just pops it right off right there. I think you get the idea of what I'm talking about. The blood, of course, whether it was a larger animal or smaller, when the blood is applied to the wall of the altar, and the bird's crop in this case and its adjoining feathers are removed and then discarded, just like the larger animal. The Torah tells us that the skin was discarded by this particular in this particular instance of the olah. So after the blood is removed from the bird, the adjoining feathers and such are removed, then the bird's body is burned upon the altar. Thus, it is also an olah. Footnote number 11, as you'll see, is also taken from Chabad.org. Now, let's look at some more details concerning this olah. Let's turn introspectively towards perhaps what is the meaning of this olah? Why is this the first one mentioned? And why later on in the prophets are we going to find that burnt offerings and festive offerings, the shlamim that we're going to talk about, why are these two offerings actually mentioned very often as we read throughout the rest of the TaNaKH? Well, upon analysis, we see that the daily olah service, the one that we talked about earlier, the korban tamid, the two lambs that are sacrificed daily, this service involved at least 3 different locations in descending holiness. If we were to examine the detail concerning this particular korban, the 3 locations that we observe are that the animal is first brought to the Kohen and placed on top of the altar. That's the most holy place for this animal. That's where the animal is designed to go. After the animal is burnt down to ashes, some of the ashes are scooped away and they're put to a place right next to the altar. And that's still a holy place. They're not just discarded or anything like that just yet. They're placed next to the altar. And then if you remember, or maybe you do, maybe you don't, and if not, we'll read about it in an upcoming Torah portion. Once the daily sacrifices are completed and it's nighttime, there's a priest who officiates and makes sure that this altar is kind of smoldering throughout the entire night, that the ashes don't burn down completely, and he makes sure that there's always some spark there. There's some kindling flame there. Even if he has to add a few little twigs, he's going to make sure that this fire doesn't go out, so that in the morning, the priest who begins officiating with the morning tamid offering, the shacharit offering, then he's going to have he's going to have an existing flame there to place the new lamb on top of. And so at that point in time, the ashes that were collected and put next to the altar in that second holy place, they're going to be removed outside of the chatzar, the courtyard, and they're going to be taken to a ritually clean place designated outside the camp. So we have those 3 levels of what we might call descending holiness: on top of the altar, next to the altar, and then this ritually clean place outside the camp. In fact, for Rav Kook, which is Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, he lived from 1865 to 1935. He was actually the first chief rabbi of the land of Israel, appointed chief rabbi before Israel was a state. For him, if you read through his notes, speaking of this olah, the completely burnt offering was a metaphor. For what? For the very highest level of contact between man and God. Why did he think of it this way? Well, he used to reflect that the fire on the altar reflects sublime experiences of inspiration and prophecy. At this level, he used to say, the material world is of no consequence. Everything gets burnt up on the altar. The fire totally consumes the flesh of the offering. That is to say, by comparison to the shlamim that we're going to read about here in a moment, no one eats any part of the olah. It all goes to God. And we read actually at the end of chapter 1, reading about the olah, it's described as a re'ach nichoach la'Adonai. What is a re'ach nichoach la'Adonai? A pleasing aroma to God. This fire goes up to Him entirely. And he is happy. He's pleased because the worshiper has performed his duty. He's been obedient to the words of the Lord. And that's why Rav Kook is making these comments. The fire totally consumes the flesh of the offering, freeing man, as it were, spiritually from the shackles of his physical reality. In other words, the kindling of the holy flames on man's soul is outside the framework of normal life. Rav Kook saw this offering as a substitute. The offering, the korban, the olah, was a type and shadow of the person bringing the korban olah. And therefore, when the fire went up on the altar, it's as if the man's soul was on the altar, as if the man's body was on the altar, so to say. I mean, he's not too far from the truth, right? That the sacrifices are, how do we say, they are go-betweens. They are trade-offs. We are supposed to be the ones being slaughtered, and yet God in His mercy allowed the animals to receive the death instead of us. We know this to be true. Anyway, Rabbi Kook was trying to make this connection and between the fire that goes completely up on the altar and between the purpose of the person bringing this. Such divine interaction is beyond the ordinary structures of human existence, both individual and collective, he was used to saying. The olah offering burns on the altar itself, by itself. Nothing else goes up there with the olah at this time. This belongs to God. It is a pleasing aroma to God, a re'ach nichoach la'Adonai. Let's move on to the next one. The next offering that we encounter in our list of Leviticus is known as the mincha, otherwise translated as grain offering. This next paragraph is entitled Mincha, grain offering. Let's again quote from Chabad.org. Quote, "And a soul who shall offer a meal offering to God." Meal offerings, called menachot in the plural, gifts, are prepared of fine flour. Now, did you notice that I went straight from one definition of the mincha, grain offering, to another definition, gifts? What's the difference? Well, the word mincha is referred to as grain offering, but the word mincha also means gift. That's the point. A mincha is a gift. Remember, these first three offerings are voluntary offerings. They are not mandatory. Anyone can bring them. They can be brought at any time. They are free will offerings. They're not required per se. At least the olah later on became part of an ingredient in one that was not voluntary. But for now, just think of these first three as free will offerings. Anyone can bring them at any time as their heart was moved by either the Spirit of God or just by their own heart. So this word mincha, which we later come to know is the afternoon prayers, right? The mincha prayers. But before it was termed that, it was the grain offering. It was the gift. Therefore, the meal offering is called menachot, gifts, which is also a name of one of the tractates in the Talmud. Gifts, they are prepared of fine flour with olive oil and with frankincense. Very simple bread substance that we're talking about. The priest removes he removes a kometz, which is a handful of flour that he was able to actually grasp with if you're looking at your left hand, it would be the second, third, and fourth fingers on your left hand, the middle fingers. Just exclude the thumb and the pinky. Those three remaining fingers. He was to grasp an amount of handful by these three fingers, those three middle fingers. That's a kometz. And this amount was to be burned on the altar, and the remainder is eaten by the priest. Notice, in the mincha, a portion is taken out, given to God, burned up on the altar, and then the rest, in typical covenant meal fashion, is eaten by the priest, the one who's officiating. Now, there are 5 types of donated meal offerings, 5 types of minachot. Let's list them. Number 1, the standard meal offering, whose kometz is removed before it's baked. That's the one we just described. Number 2, we had the baked meal offering, which came in 2 forms. One of the forms was a loaf, or 3, the flat matzot. So now we've got 3. We've got the standard, we've got the loaf, and then we've got the flat matzah, like the cracker type. That's 3. The 4th type of mincha was what's known as the pan-fried meal offering. And then the 5th one was known as the minchat marcheshet. That was basically a deep-fried mincha, deep fried like in a deeper pot rather than a shallow pan like number 4 mentioned. So basically, if you think about it, the different types of minchot, the names of them depending on how they're fried up and whether or not a portion was removed and things like that. And these bread offerings, these meal offerings, these grain offerings, I think that does the KJV call them cereal offerings? I can't remember. I don't have my KJV in front of me at the moment. But these offerings were very tasty. I mean, with a little bit of oil in there and a fine flour, a little bit of frankincense. You beginning to get hungry now? Let's read a following rule concerning these particular minchot. The following rule applies to all of the meal offerings, including the loaves. Okay, no meal offering. This is a verse. No meal offering which you shall bring to God shall be made leavened. None of the meal offerings that were made were allowed to be burnt in a leavened state, even the ones that were loaves. Now, the reason we mention loaves is because typically loaves involve a little bit of rising, right? No offering which you shall bring to God shall be made leavened, for you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey, nor any offering of God made by fire. When the priest took the komets out and he burned it on the altar there, even when it was a loaf, even when it was allowed to leaven, none of the leaven was to be burnt afterwards. That is to say, he had to take that little komets out and throw it on the altar before any leavening could happen, which means we're talking about something that took place very, very quickly. Because what does it take for leaven to show up? Just water, the flour, one of the 5 grains that we're talking about here, which is barley, oats, rye, spelt, or wheat. Those are one of the 5 grains that were historically used to make these types of offerings. And thyme, right? You get water, you get one of those grains, and you get thyme, and what do you get next? You get leaven, you get the chametz, and that's not allowed on the altar. We're going to find out later on that there are 2 offerings where the loaves are included in the offering. One is the shalmi toda, a type of a shlamim offering that we're going to read about later on. And then later on, when we're reading about the festival of Shavuot, or Pentecost, as it's known in Christian circles, then the loaves brought on Pentecost are also leavened. But the key ingredient is this, pun intended, in no case is leaven to go up on the altar burnt. Okay? Once you remove the komets, not the chametz, the komets, and throw it on the altar, once the priest did that, then he could bake it into a loaf, and there he might get some chametz, some rising of the dough, some fermentation of the dough, but that was after the fact, and it didn't go up on the altar. You guys following me so far? Great. Another rule that we learn about the mincha is that, according to another verse, quote, your every meal offering you shall season with salt. Never shall you suspend the salt covenant of your God. That's an interesting feature, too. You've heard of the salt covenant? This was where we get this information. All of the korbanot, in fact, were offered with salt, and that's what Chabad.org tells us. This latter rule applies to all of the festivals. All of the offerings. Another meal offering that's mentioned here is, as I mentioned, is the maybe I didn't mention it. It's the minchat bikurim, also called the omer. It's brought on the 2nd day of Pesach from the year's very first barley harvest. And in this mincha, the kernels are roasted by fire before they're ground into flour. There's an extra step that's taken before it actually moves towards the altar and things like that. Just some details that are interesting to know. We don't know all the reasons why God gave every one of these details, but we do know that they were meant to be followed, and therefore if we lived in ancient Israel, we needed to follow them. In addition, a meal offering accompanied all animal offerings. If you notice, a mincha is a non-animal offering. It's a grain offering. Doesn't have any blood involved. But whenever we got to animal offerings, a mincha was supplied along with the animal offerings. Okay, let's keep going. Next paragraph is entitled Shlamim, peace offering. Shlamim. This one's a real neat offering. This one is a very popular offering. You could say it is a festivity offering. It's a group offering. It's a corporate offering. And the reason is because typically a representative from the family would bring this, and as we're going to find out later on, it was eaten both by himself as well as some of the Kohanim there. So it was kind of a family affair. It was a shared offering. Perhaps often the whole family came when the shlamim was being brought to the courtyard that day. The shlamim or peace offering could either be a male or female, and either from the herd, in essence an ox or a cow, or a sheep or a goat. That's what we call from the herd or from the flock. When the Torah says from the herd or from the flock, the word herd refers to ox or cow, and the word flock refers to sheep or goat. Now, like the Olah offering, the shlamim, its blood was sprinkled on the altar. Remember, it's an animal offering. It's not a grain offering. The blood was, it was shechted. Its throat was cut. The blood was caught, sprinkled upon the altar. The remainder of the blood, by the way, was poured out at the base of the altar. But unlike the Olah, which ascended in its entirety upon the altar, that's where we get the name Olah, the meat of the shlamim was eaten by the owner, the person who brought it. The one who brought the offering got to partake of it this time. 2 portions of the animal, the breast and the right thigh, however, were eaten by the Kohanim, the priests. So they're all sharing in this meal together. And this made for a unique type of korban, a unique type of festive experience. I keep using the word festive because in the Torah, the shlamim is referred to as a zavach. And the word zavach is sometimes called a festivity offering. In fact, if I turn in my Torah to chapter 3, reading from the Stone Edition TaNaKH, it says, quote, verse 1, chapter 3, verse 1, if his offering is a feast peace offering, a feast peace offering, v'im zavach shlamim korbano im min ha-korban hu. And this language here, v'im zavach is a noun that refers to this type of offering. But the word zevach comes from the verb zavach, which means to slaughter. And that's why it's called a feast peace offering, a slaughtered offering. Perhaps because it entails more. Usually, like if you kill one person, we say that's a killing. But if you kill a lot of people, we say that's a slaughter. Maybe the language here, slaughter, is referring to the fact that multiple people are going to partake of this particular incident. Anyway, the word zevach and zavach are also related to the word for the altar itself, the mizbeach, the instrument or the piece of furniture that receives the zevach, the slaughter itself, the offering. This offering, this korban, was eaten by more than just the participant. As I already mentioned, the Kohanim get to eat of it. The breast and the right thigh are eaten by the priest. Only certain parts of the animal are going to be burned atop the altar, like the olah. Part of it's burned, part of it's eaten. Let's read the verse here. The fat that covers the inwards, or the innards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards, and the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them, which is by the flanks and the appendage of the liver, which he shall remove with the kidneys. That's the part that goes up on the altar, and the rest gets eaten. Chabad goes on to say, if the peace offering is a sheep, let's say it's not from the herd, it's not an ox or a cow, it's a smaller one, the whole fat tail up to the backbone was added to what I just read that goes up on the altar and gets burnt. Let's read the verse. And the priest shall burn it on the altar. It is divine food, a fire offering, a sweet savor to God. Notice that the shlamim is described as a fire offering, and then it's also described, like we read before, a nichoach. I'm sorry, re'ach nichoach. It's described as an olah of sorts, a fire offering. Part of it goes up to God, but part of it's eaten. That's why we need to know some of these Hebrew terms. But the part I wanted to emphasize is that last phrase, re'ach nichoach. It is a pleasing aroma. Literally, an aromatic aroma is the Hebrew. It's kind of it's redundant there. Re'ach nichoach. It's kind of repeating the same word twice. It's trying to emphasize that it is an aromatic aroma. That sounds redundant to us, right? Because these types of offering, the shlamim, was offered to God on the altar, these specified veins of fat, which the Torah calls chalev, these parts of the fat are choice fats. They belong to God. They get burnt up on the altar. Therefore, they are usher. They are forbidden for consumption in all animals. We can't eat these fats. This is the forbidden fat, the chaylev. This is the part that should be removed when we are partaking of kosher food today. We're not supposed to be eating the chaylev, okay? It shall be a perpetual statute for your generations to all your habitations. All chaylev and all blood you shall not eat. End quote. We're going to read more about these forbidden pieces of animals, the chaylev and the dam, the fat and the blood respectively, in a different parasha. So listen for it when we come to that particular section. Okay, let's keep going. I want to move now past the 3 voluntary offerings into a section where we're going to deal with the expiatory sacrifices. What do I mean by expiatory? Let me just give you a kind of a standard dictionary definition. The word expiation is a verb, and it means to atone for. Atone for what? Atone for guilt or sin, right? Expiatory, atonement. We're now going to move into the more important or the more critical types of korbanot that we read about in the book of Leviticus. This next section is entitled Expiatory Sacrifices. A quote from the JPS commentary to Leviticus is in order before we study these last 2 types of korbanot. I need you to follow along with me very, very carefully now to this section in my commentary, all right? Quote, Chapters 4 and 5 contain the laws governing expiatory sacrifices, the purpose of which is to secure atonement and forgiveness from God. These offerings are efficacious only when offenses are inadvertent or unwitting. We're going to talk about those 2 in a moment. They do not apply to defined or premeditated crimes. Whenever an individual Israelite or a tribal leader or a priest or even the chief priest or the Israelite community at large is guilty of an inadvertent offense or of failing to do what the law requires, expiation through such sacrifice is required. JPS goes on to say, the laws of chapters 4 and 5 here in Leviticus do not specify all the offenses for which such sacrifices are mandated. Did you catch that? The chapters don't really lay out exactly what these types of offenses entail. Instead, we may assume, they go on to say, as did the rabbinic sages, that there is a correspondence between those offenses requiring the expiatory offerings and those punishable by the penalty known as karet. Now, karet is the cutting off of the offender from the community. The person was, to use today's parlance, we would say they were excommunicated. They were put outside the camp back in those days. The expiatory sacrifices, JPS concludes, are required for inadvertent transgressions that, if committed defiantly, would in fact bring the offender the penalty of being cut off from the community. Karet, end quote. The footnote number 14 you'll see is from Baruch A. Levine, the JPS Torah Commentary to Leviticus, Jewish Publication Society, 1989, and that was lifted from page 18. It's very important for you to listen now that we understand the category of sins being described here. Basically, there are 2 categories of sin that Leviticus is describing for us, and that's probably why we don't simply get an enumeration, a list, a simple list. Although when we get to the let's see, when we get to the sin offering, we're going to see that some of it's spelled out, as well as some is spelled out in the guilt offering as well. But it's important that we understand for now that the Torah does not clearly describe sins of intent in easy-to-understand terms. To be sure, unintentional sins are represented by a very technical term in the Torah known in Hebrew as bishgaga. We're near the bottom of page 11, about to move into page 12, so follow along with me in the written notes if you can. Bishgaga. All right? This is a word that's found only 6 times in Leviticus altogether. We're in the top of page 12. Look at the footnote number 15, and you'll see in Leviticus all the locations where this phrase bishgaga, the root word is shogeg, where this word shows up. Now, why do we care? Listen on. Tim Hegg is going to remark on bishgaga in this short excerpt lifted from a commentary out of his on the topic of forgiveness. Quote, this is Tim Hegg. A study of the words unintentional and intentional when describing sins reveals something different, however. Okay? Intentional and unintentional. In Leviticus 6, verses 1 through 7, the sins for which a person may bring a guilt offering, remember the word for guilt offering is asham. The sins for which an asham is required include lying, theft, fraud, perjury, and debauchery. All right? Those are actually spelled out in the Torah. Yet in Leviticus 4, the sins of a leader or a common priest for which a guilt offering may atone are called unintentional. And the Hebrew is bishgaga. Now, in Tim's opinion, in his opinion, this is not actually a very good translation, this word unintentional, however, because it makes it appear as though one can lie, steal, defraud, perjure oneself, and engage in all manner of debauchery without direct intent to do so. You catching me? You catching what I'm saying here? The Torah lists some of the sins under the category of asham, and then it calls these unintentional. And yet it sounds as if a person can say, well, I lied, but I didn't mean it. I committed fraud, but I didn't mean it. I stole something, but I didn't mean it. That's why he says the word unintentional is not necessarily the best translation. Actually, TaNaKH goes on to say this word does not describe one's attitude or intentions in the matter. Okay? When we say unintentional, it really isn't describing the person's attitude towards the sin that he's committed, but simply, he says, the class of sins for which there exists a prescribed sacrifice. In other words, it's just a technical category, the bishgaga. The basic meaning of the word means mistake, and thus the English translator's word unintentional. It didn't mean to happen. It was not intentional. It wasn't meant to happen. It happened by mistake. And so, therefore, if you think about it, the person bringing the sacrifice can have one intention, and then a different result may happen. So you see how I mean that the word unintentional may not exactly point to the intent of the individual. It's really just describing the category of sin. TaNaKH goes on to say the basic meaning of the word is mistake, and thus the English translator's unintentional. But it also simply means unacceptable behavior. It's something that shouldn't have happened. It was wrong. What is striking is that nowhere in the Torah are intentional sins described. Now we're going to contrast. Nowhere does the Torah actually say, here's an intentional sin, and then tells you what it is. Rather, Tim goes on to say, the opposite of so-called unintentional sin, that category, is the category what we call of a high hand. And the Hebrew is vah-yeek-rah, the sin of a high hand. As in Numbers chapter 15, verse 30, the incident where the man gathered sticks, on the Sabbath day, and then the Torah talks about sinning with a high hand, and then we move right into the mitzvah about wearing tzitzit. Numbers chapter 15. Now, Tim goes on to say that this describes rebellion, this vah-yeek-rah, the sin of a high hand. Take your hand, take your left or right hand, doesn't matter, raise it up, close your fist and kind of wave it heavenward. That's kind of what we might think of the word picture that comes to mind when the Hebrew says vah-yeek-rah. The word rama means high or elevated, rama, and the word bayad means of the hand. So of the hand that is upraised, the upraised arm, the sin of a high hand. This describes rebellion, a sin for which there's no expiation. This describes the intention of the individual. This describes the attitude of the individual. And it's still a category sin. But God is able to see through to the heart of what's going on here. It is rebellion, and for this, God says, no expiation for you unless you get your heart right. Thus, as long as a person persists in his rebellion, TaNaKH goes on to say, there is no means of forgiveness here, people. Only when this person turns from his rebellion and seeks atonement through the prescribed sacrifice is he in fact forgiven by God. The animals in and of themselves and by themselves cannot bring the required atonement that God says is offered. It requires a change of heart. It requires a broken heart. Rebellion is not allowed. There are therefore only two classes of sins described in the Torah, TaNaKH says. Bishgaga, usually translated unintentional, for which there is no expiation, and vah-yeek-rah, the high hand, for which I read that wrong. Bishgaga, unintentional, for which there is expiation, TaNaKH says, and vah-yeek-rah, the high hand, for which there is no expiation, end quote. I lifted that resource of Tim Haig's. You can see footnote number 16 down at the bottom of page 12 at TorahResource.com, English articles under forgiveness. Let's continue. Levine, in the JPS commentary, continues to Leviticus to explain the asham and the chata'at. Let's keep reading. Quote, in substance, chapters 4 through 5 prescribe two principal sacrifices. What are they? The chata'at and the asham. The object of the chata'at, usually translated sin offering, was to remove the culpability borne by the offender, that is, to purify the offender of his guilt. You can read chapter 4 of Leviticus, verses 1 through chapter 5, verse 13, to read about the chata'at. All right? The asham, usually translated guilt offering, was actually a penalty paid in the form of a sacrificial offering to God. Notice the language penalty. You ever been to court and had to pay a fine? Yeah, that's kind of what's going on, right? The asham, it applied when one had unintentionally misappropriated property that belonged to the sanctuary or had been contributed to it unintentionally. In other words, he gained something that wasn't his by mistake. Or, in certain cases, when one had sworn falsely concerning his responsibility toward the property of others, false testimony. A false oath brings God into the picture. Why? Because the oath is made to God. I swear, in court session again, you raise your hand, you say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Typically, when you say that, where is your other hand? It's on the Bible. Right, we're bringing God into the picture. That's why the asham is described this way. JPS goes on to say, the sacrifice did not relieve the offender of his duty to make full restitution for the loss he had caused another person. Very important phrase there. Just because God forgives us on the heavenly court doesn't mean that we don't have to remunerate. Hard word to say. We don't have to pay back that which was owed to our fellow man, the person that we wronged. That's what it means to pay someone for services rendered or for work done. To pay them back, as it were, for something that we owe them. We work for them, or in the case of the phrase remunerate, remunerate. We pay someone for services rendered. In the case of where we wrong a certain man, we have to pay them back for that which we wronged them. The sacrifice did not relieve the offender of this duty. In fact, JPS goes on to say the offender was fined 20% of the lost value. So if I steal $100 from my fellow man, whether I knew it or not, and then I get caught, according to the rules of the asham, right, then I not only had to pay him back the $100, but I had to pay him $20 more, a fifth, 20%. So I had to pay him $120. That's what the Torah is trying to tell us here, okay? The asham merely squared the offender with his God, whose name he had taken in vain when he swore to take this oath. And so that's why we need to know the details about this. You can read chapter 5, verses 14 through 26 to read more about this particular detail about the asham. My quote from JPS, if you'll see, footnote number 17, Baruch Levine, the JPS Torah commentary to Leviticus, Jewish Publication Society, 1989, again, page 18. Let us provide now a brief description of the chata'at and the asham respectively, and then we'll bring this part of my commentary to a close. Okay, just real brief. This section, or this paragraph, is entitled Chata'at, Sin Offering. The sin offering proper is a sacrifice consisting of either a beast or a fowl, and it's offered on the altar to atone for sin committed unwittingly. It's bishgaga. The rules concerning the sin offering are as follows. If the anointed priest or the whole congregation commits a sin through ignorance, well, then the sin offering is a young bull without blemish. It's a larger animal. Should the ruler so sin, notice how we're going downwards in level of authority, or downwards, we're diminishing our level of leadership here in this example. Should the ruler so sin, his offering is a male kid without blemish, a smaller animal. But when a private individual sins, his offering must either be a female kid or a female lamb without blemish, or if he's too poor to provide one of these, then a turtle dove is also acceptable as a chata'at, a sin offering. Okay? Sin offerings were brought on other occasions as well. Remember, on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16, the high priest inaugurated the festival with 2
chata'ot, 2 sin offerings. We had a bullock as his own offering, and then a male kid for the congregation. Those were both considered chata'at, sin offerings. The flesh of these offerings was not eaten. But after the fat had been removed, that cheleb, that forbidden fat, the carcasses were burned outside the camp. You can read about that in Leviticus 26, verse 3, verse 5, and verse 10 and 11, as well as verse 25 and 27 of chapter 26. Also, concerning the chata'at, a woman after the days of her purification, remember when she was in nida? And we can read about that later on in the Torah as well. After she had gone through this purification time period, after the end of it, she also was required to bring a dove for a sin offering, and it was called a chata'at. You're thinking, gosh, all she did was go into her menstrual cycle. Why is it called a sin offering? Well, it's a technical term for a technical korban. It doesn't necessarily mean that she sinned. Just like we talked about earlier, the olah uses the language of sin in that offering, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person sinned. In addition to a burnt offering, this woman brought the chata'at. So she brought both a chata'at as well as an olah. A leper, by the way, on the day of his cleansing, and we read about him in Leviticus as well, and also we read about him, just in Leviticus. A leper on the day of his cleansing was required to bring, besides other offerings, a female lamb, or if he were too poor, a dove for a sin offering, a chata'at. You can read about that in Leviticus 12, verse 6, as well as Leviticus 14:10, Leviticus 14:19, and Leviticus 14:22. Finally, we're on our last offering. We've gone through 4 of them. Let's hit the 5th one. The asham, known as the guilt offering. This last little paragraph here, we're near the bottom of page 13. Torah.org is going to give us some information concerning this last one. Quote, the asham offering has many applications. Like the chata'at, or the chatas is what they say, it is a sin offering. However, the asham atones for intentional sinning. Intentional sinning? Yeah, it's still a category, and it's not sins of a high hand. It's slightly different than that. It's not vah-yeek-rah. It's not rebellious sin, but it is intentional sin. Swearing falsely is one such example. God is the unseen third party who is present wherever and whenever one man has dealings with another. That is to say, we don't want to simply say that sins are unintentional. We don't want to simply say that lying, swearing falsely, perjury, those things. We don't want to say simply that they are unintentional, because typically when people do these things, when they lie, they are intending to lie. So we can say unintentional and intentional. It's kind of both. I'm not really trying to confuse you, but what I'm trying to say is it's not rebellious. It's not vah-yeek-rah. It's not that category. It still falls under the category of bishgaga, unintentional. It was a mistake. It was a mistake. Swearing falsely is a mistake. Okay, lying is a mistake. It's something that shouldn't happen. It's something that is wrong. Okay, it's sins that shouldn't happen. That's what I mean by unintentional/intentional there. God is the unseen third party who is present wherever and whenever one man has dealings with another, even if no other witnesses are on hand. If you swear, then God is there because His presence is everywhere. God Himself is the guarantor for the honest dealings between men. There's 3 parties really involved. If I swear to my brother that I'm going to do something for him, God is the unseen third party. If, therefore, this guarantor is invoked as a witness, if I say I swear by heaven, then any factor in these dealings has been disavowed. When any factor in these dealings has been disavowed, I go back on my word after I've already sworn by heaven that I'm going to do it, then is it not, it's not merely an act of ordinary faithlessness. It's not merely that I just broke faith with my fellow brother. I promised to do something for him. I swear by heaven that I would do it. I didn't follow through with my promise. I didn't do it. But also, I'm guilty before God. That's the point. In these cases, the offender has pledged his priestly character, his relationship to God, as surety for his honesty. End quote. That's what Torah.org is trying to get us to see. And because of this, the asham needs to be brought into the picture. Okay, it's a little different than the sin offering, the chata'at that we just read about. A standard Judaic offering, or a standard Judaic definition of the asham, might read something like this. It's a guilt offering. It's an offering to atone for sins of stealing things from the altar, for when you are not sure whether you've committed a sin or what sin you have committed, or for breach of trust, like we just described. Stealing things from the altar? Come on, people. Who would steal from the altar? The Hebrew word for guilt offering is asham. When there was doubt as to whether a person committed a sin, the person would bring an asham if he wasn't sure if he sinned or not. Because by admitting sin, then he brings a chata'at. But if he says, I'm not sure if I sinned or not, then an asham was brought rather than a chata'at. Because again, bringing a chata'at would constitute admission of the sin, and the person would have to be punished accordingly for it. See the difference between the two? If a person brought an asham and later discovered that he had in fact committed the sin after the fact, well then, oh yes, he would have to bring a chata'at at that time if it was proven that what he did was in fact a commitment of sin, and then he had agreed to it. Oh yeah, I did do that. Well, then it automatically retroactively turns from an asham type of guilt to a chata'at type of guilt, and the type of offering changes. An asham finally was eaten by the Kohanim. That's another difference between the chata'at and the asham. The chata'at, if you remember, wasn't eaten by the priest. It was burned up on the altar and such, whereas the asham was actually eaten by the priest. And for now, that's going to do it on this section of the 5 types of korbanot. So that concludes Part B of our study on the korbanot. We looked in Part B at the 6 different types of or categories of offerings. I say 5, and then I also mentioned. Sorry, the headphone got caught in my hair there. I say 5 and mention 6 because the 5 types, if you remember, were the olah, the mincha, the shlamim, the chata'at, and then finally the asham. But we started our study with the tamid. So if you want to call the tamid a 6th category, you're welcome to. But technically, the tamid is an olah. And with that, we'll conclude Part B of the studies. Stick around for the final and concluding Part C of our study, the Parashat Vayikra.